Hello everyone and welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Grant Olson and I am the Education Coordinator here at Seed Savers Exchange. And tonight we will be talking about isolation techniques. So different ways to ensure that cross-pollination is not occurring in your garden and ways to ensure that generation after generation the seeds that you save will produce plants that are true to type and maintain the characteristics of that variety in every generation. If you're just getting to know Seed Savers Exchange, our mission is to save North America's diverse but endangered garden heritage for future generations by building a network of people committed to collecting, conserving, and sharing heirloom seeds and plants while educating people about the value of genetic and cultural diversity. We'll start with a very brief definition of seed saving and an introduction to some of the terms that we will be discussing. Seed saving is a process of saving seeds from open-pollinated fruits, vegetables, flowers, and herbs. And that open-pollinated part is very important. Open-pollinated varieties are maintained by allowing pollen to flow only between plants of the same variety. When pollen flows between different varieties within the same species, this is known as cross-pollination. And cross-pollinated seed is not ideal for seed saving, particularly if you're interested in maintaining the characteristics of a variety generation after generation. This illustration is a very simple representation of what can occur when cross-pollination happens in the garden. Let's say I've planted this large red ribbed tomato and it has maybe a very tangy flavor to it. I plant right next to that tomato, I plant a little tiny yellow cherry tomato. If pollen moves, let's say pollen moves from the flowers of the little cherry tomato to the flowers of the big red tomato, I save seeds from that big red tomato, I plant those seeds, and then in the next generation, I might end up with something that looks like this. I could end up with something that looks a little bit like the big ribbed tomato, but it's orange. Maybe it has all the flavor characteristics of the little tiny orange tomato. Anything can happen in this first generation, and so you're not quite sure what you might find as a result of that cross, but you know that it's not exactly what you were expecting when you save seeds from that big red tomato. And so isolation techniques can help you to ensure that pollen is not moving between two varieties within the same species and giving you sort of off-type plants like this cross-pollinated ribbed orange tomato. As I mentioned before, cross-pollinated seed is not ideal for seed saving if you're interested in maintaining the characteristics of a variety throughout several generations. So some form of isolation may be necessary to prevent cross-pollination between plants of different varieties within the same species. Because anytime pollen moves between two different varieties within the same species, you save those seeds and you get something mixed up, as in the case of the orange ribbed tomato. Depending on your plants and your environment, however, isolation may not be required. This diagram here helps me sort of show the process of pollination. And so pollination is the result of pollen moving from the anther, which is the male sort of pollen producing part of the flower, to the stigma, which is the pollen receptive part of the flower. Once pollen moves from the anther to the stigma, a pollen tube forms. That pollen fertilizes the ovary, and after fertilization, then seeds will form in the ovary. This flower here is what we would call a perfect flower. It has male and female organs in the same flower, but not every flower is like this. And the bulk of this presentation is understanding how pollen travels from an anther to a stigma and how that affects the ways that you might isolate your plants. As I mentioned, with cross-pollination occurs when pollen moves between two varieties within the same species. The easiest way to make sure that your seed is not cross-pollinated is to just simply grow one variety, grow many plants of just one variety, and make sure that there are no other plants within that same species around that could potentially cross-pollinate that. And when I say making sure there's no plants around, around can be very different depending on your plant type. And so this begins a conversation of isolation by distance. In this photo here, there are some different varieties of tomatoes, and isolating tomatoes may mean planting 2 different varieties of tomatoes 20 feet apart from one another and then saving the seed. If you have 2 different varieties of peas, they may be planted only 10 feet apart and you may be saving the seeds from those. With other crops, however, depending on the way that they pollinate, isolation by distance may require the 2 different varieties be separated by a mile or 2 miles or more, 5 miles in the case of beets, for example. And so this next part of the presentation will discuss how several major garden crops are pollinated, different ways to isolate them both by distance and also some physical barriers as well. As we begin talking about isolation by distance, I want to be clear that the isolation distances that I am referring to are primarily for home gardeners who are maybe less concerned with cross-pollination than a commercial seed company. If you have a very rare variety, a variety you're very concerned with, it's safe to say that commercial seed companies or any sort of grower intending to share these seeds with others may potentially even double these distances that I'll be discussing. But for seed saving purposes at home, where you may not have really large distances to isolate by, the guidelines that I'll recommend should be good enough. And again, if you do have any concerns, simply increase the distance if you have the space. The first group of plants that I'll discuss are self-pollinating plants, plants that have perfect flowers, and each flower largely pollinates itself. And so pollen is not moving between 2 flowers, pollen is simply moving from the anther on one flower to the stigma of that same flower. The photo on the screen is a pea flower. It has very similar flower structure to beans as well. They have a flower structure called a keel, which I've pulled off. It's sitting just below the flower on the right. That keel protects the anther and stigma and sort of isolates the stigma on that flower from pollen sources outside of the anthers that are inside that keel. And so beans and peas do not require large isolation distances. If you had beans and peas, if you had 2 different varieties of peas and you planted them 10 feet away from one another, that would probably be sufficient. Same with beans as well. Some tomatoes are also largely self-pollinating. Tomatoes as well have perfect flowers. Tomatoes have a flower structure that also isolates the stigma from pollen that may be coming from different flowers, either on that same plant or on a different plant or even on plants of a different variety. So that cone in the middle of the flower is made up of anthers, so pollen shedding anthers that have fused together and they form this protective cone. And it's very unlikely that pollen will find its way into the stigma that is buried inside that anther cone. The anthers will shed pollen and the stigma will be pollinated before any other pollen from another flower source has a chance to pollinate it. And this is true with some tomatoes, not all tomatoes, as I'll explain in a few slides. Lettuce is another plant that has perfect flowers that are largely self-pollinating. Lettuce flowers, as they open, the stigma sort of emerges and brushes against all of the anthers in that flower. Flowers open for a little bit, it closes up and it doesn't open again. So that stigma has been pollinated even before the flower opens. And so if you have 2 different lettuce varieties, grow those plants 10 feet apart, and that'll be sufficient for isolation by distance. This next group of plants also has perfect flowers. However, they're largely insect pollinated rather than self-pollinated. See in this picture of an okra flower here, flower is big, it's very open, it's very showy. There's no structure protecting the stigma from outside sources of pollen. And so these are much more likely to cross-pollinate with other varieties that you may have. And so these plant types need to be isolated by a greater distance. When we're talking about insect-pollinated perfect flowers, this sort of standard is 1/8 of a mile to 1/4 mile of isolation by distance. Depending on your environment, what plants you have surrounding it, any houses or fences or other physical barriers that may interfere with an insect's flight path. When we're isolating insect-pollinated plants from each other, if they have perfect flowers, we're keeping plants of different varieties far enough away that a bee will not visit one flower here, that a bee will not visit one flower of one variety, and then on that same trip visit another flower on a plant of a different variety within that same species. And so you could have a lot of pollen sources between two different varieties that sort of distract the bee, and so it's unlikely that they'll visit an okra flower and then pass up all these other sources of pollen to visit another okra flower further away in the garden. And as I mentioned, an eighth of a mile to a quarter of a mile is pretty standard. And because these plant types are attractive to insects, we do certainly want to encourage these insects to move pollen around between different plants, but only of the same variety. We want to encourage these plants to sort of share genetic information with one another, but maintain the characteristics of that plant from one generation to the next. So although we want that exchange of pollen between plants, we want to restrict that exchange of pollen between plants only of the same variety. And so you may grow one group of okra, maybe you have 10 okra plants in one area of the garden, pollen can move between those 10 plants, and in a separate area of the garden, you have another 10 plants of a different variety of okra that as well can share pollen, but not between the two varieties. Peppers as well have perfect flowers that are very showy and very attractive to insects, so these two need to be isolated accordingly. Eggplant, again, very similar flower structure, perfect flowers, attractive to insects. They need to be isolated by an eighth to a quarter of a mile as well. As I mentioned when we were talking about tomatoes before, some tomatoes are very likely to self-pollinate, others are somewhat more susceptible to pollination by insects and pollination between two different flowers. In this photo here we have two tomato flowers of different varieties. The tomato flower on the right has a flower structure very similar to the one we saw earlier. The flower on the left, however, if you look below that anther cone, you see the stigma is sticking out a little bit, making it more likely that it could be pollinated by insects traveling between different plants. So look closely at the tomato flowers of the varieties that you have. If it has an exerted stigma, as on the left, you may want to isolate it by an eighth of a mile to a quarter of a mile. The flower on the right, if you have tomato plants that have that inserted stigma, the stigma is not sticking out at all, those can be safely isolated by 10 feet, 20 feet. Onions have perfect flowers. They have flowers that have male and female organs. However, pollen is not being shed at the same time that the stigma is receptive to that pollen. So even though pollen is being shed, it cannot pollinate the stigma of that same flower because that flower isn't ready to accept that pollen. And so they rely on insects to bring pollen from one flower to another. And as we were discussing with other insect-pollinated plants, there should be a quarter of a mile between onion plants of different varieties. This next group of plants is also insect-pollinated, however, they do not have perfect flowers. These plants are what we would call monoecious. They have male flowers and they have female flowers that are separate. So each flower either has male organs or female organs, but not both. And so they require insects to move pollen between a male flower and a female flower for pollination and fertilization to occur. They're very showy, they're very attractive to insects. And again, because we're discussing insects, the standard to use for these should probably be a quarter mile because they do not have any ability to pollinate themselves. It may be that a bee moves pollen from a male flower and a female flower on the same plant, but the insects are not going to care if they're moving pollen between two flowers on the same plant or two flowers on different plants. And it may be that those flowers on different plants are flowers of different varieties as well. This is a cucumber flower here. This is a female cucumber flower. You can tell the difference between male and female flowers because at the base of a female flower, there's a tiny immature fruit. As soon as that female flower is pollinated, that fruit will start to grow and develop. Male flowers, on the other hand, are simply borne on stalks without any sort of fruit or swelling beneath the blossom. Melons are pollinated the same way as are watermelons. And again, this is a female watermelon blossom. You can tell because it has a tiny immature watermelon at the base of that flower. All of these plants have been insect pollinated. There are monoecious plants that are wind pollinated as well. And this photo here is of corn. These are the male flowers of a corn. The male flowers on a corn plant are the tassels. You can see in this photo here the anthers, the small yellow structures have dropped out of the tassels and they're shedding pollen. So pollen falls from these anthers onto the stigma of a female flower. Corn stigmas are corn silks. So if you've peeled an ear of corn before, if you've shucked corn, you've pulled all those silks out. Those silks are the stigma of the female cornflower. Each stigma corresponds to a kernel, and so when that silk is pollinated, that fertilizes the ovary, which swells into a corn kernel. Corn pollen is very light. It doesn't often fall straight down onto the silks of that same plant. Corn pollen can travel up to 2 miles, and so if you're trying to isolate your corn by distance, you should separate 2 different varieties of corn by 1 mile or 2 miles. Here in Iowa, this is very difficult for us because all of our neighbors are growing corn, and there's nowhere on our farm that is more than 2 miles away from our neighbors. However, if you're in an area where your neighbors are not growing corn, it may be feasible to isolate your corn by distance. There are also wind-pollinated dioecious plants as well. Dioecious plants have male and female flowers that are borne on entirely different plants. So essentially, there is a male flower or a male plant and a female plant. And spinach and asparagus are sort of the only garden crops that are dioecious. Asparagus is insect pollinated, but because it's propagated largely from the crowns, we won't discuss asparagus. So in this photo of spinach, here we have the male flower in the foreground with the lighter colored flowers, and in the background see the closed flowers of the female spinach plant. There are also a group of plants that are insect pollinated but self-incompatible. So all of the brassicas, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, they have perfect flowers. Physiologically, it seems that they should be able to pollinate themselves. However, pollen will not successfully pollinate and fertilize the stigma and ovary on a flower of that same plant. So they require pollen to move between 2 different plants. And if you're saving seeds, you want to be sure that those 2 plants are plants of the same variety. And as with squash and melons and watermelons, because they don't have the ability to pollinate themselves and they are pollinated by insects, a 1/4 mile of isolation at least is necessary. There are also wind-pollinated self-incompatible plants. The plant in the photo here probably looks much different than you've seen it in your garden. This is Swiss chard or beets, also self-incompatible, meaning each plant cannot pollinate itself, and they are wind-pollinated. And so beets and Swiss chard require the most extreme isolation by distance. Commercial seed growers will isolate 2 different chard or beet varieties by 5 miles. The great thing about beets, however, is that they are biennials, and so you can also isolate them by time. Even if you're growing several varieties of beets out in your garden, if you're only saving seed from one variety, beets will only flower in their 2nd year, so they require, here in the Midwest, being dug up and overwintered in a root cellar, then planted out again. Even though there may be other beets in your garden, it's likely that only one of them is flowering, and it may be likely that you're the only person in a several mile radius that's growing out beets or Swiss chard for seed. Because again, we're only concerned with pollen moving between flowers, and so the plants are not flowering at the same time. There's no risk of pollen moving between 2 different plants or of 2 different varieties. In this photo here, we see lettuce that is at different stages of bolting. So there's lettuce in the foreground that hasn't yet flowered, and there's lettuce in the background that has flowered. And you can see they're just about growing on top of one another because they have different flowering times. And you can do this with corn as well, with a very early flowering corn and a very late flowering corn. You can grow the plants next to one another because the flowers are not open or the flowers are not receptive to pollen at the same time. And keep in mind that time isolation can also be from year to year. By saving lettuce seeds of a particular variety one year, you'll probably have enough seed to last you 5 years, 6 years, or more. And so you don't need to be growing out plants for seed every single year, particularly if you have very good storage conditions and you can save the seed for several years before you need to regenerate any seed and increase your supply. Now that you have an understanding of isolation by distance and the ways in which your plants pollinate, there are two questions you can ask yourself to determine if physical isolation is required if you are saving seed from more than one variety of the same species. The first question is, are different varieties of your crop and species being grown within the pollination zone? So the pollination zone for peas could be thought of as a circle with a 10-foot radius around each pea plant. Any other pea plants within that 10-foot radius have the potential to cross-pollinate with one another. For corn, that pollination zone would have a 1-mile radius. For squash and onions, a 1/4 mile. If there are plants of different varieties belonging to the same species growing within a pollination zone, determine whether or not these different varieties are flowering at the same time as the plants you'd like to save seed from. If they are not flowering at the same time, no physical isolation is required. However, if two plants of different varieties belonging to the same species are flowering at the same time and located within the pollination zone of each other, physical isolation will be required if you'd like to save seed from one or both of the varieties. We'll talk first about physical barriers for self-pollinating plants and plants with perfect flowers. So in this photo here, see what we have called a blossom bag is surrounding a cluster of tomato flowers there. There's a source of pollen inside that bag, and there are receptive stigmas inside that bag. That bag restricts insects from getting in there and moving pollen around and maybe introducing pollen from another plant of a different variety. But each one of those flowers will pollinate itself. So we're really just concerned with keeping pollinators away from those flowers so that those flowers can pollinate themselves. Rather than isolating a single flower, you can also isolate a single plant, as was done with this lettuce. For insect-pollinated plants, however, you want to isolate a group of plants. For example, putting an insect-proof mesh or row cover around an entire group of pepper plants or eggplants. As long as all the plants inside that barrier are of the same variety, pollen can and should be exchanged between them. It can be a little bit trickier with plants that require insects to pollinate. You can't simply isolate a blossom because pollen needs to move from one flower to another. So in this photo here, we've done what's called alternate day caging or alternate day isolation. There are what looks like kale plants or mustard plants with yellow flowers sort of behind the covered plants in the foreground. So there are several plants of one variety in the background in a cluster. They're open to the air, they're exposed to insects, so insects can travel around, they can visit different flowers, they can move pollen around between different plants to pollinate the stigma and fertilize the ovary. After a day or 2 days or a few days, we could cover up these plants in the back, and then we could remove the row cover from plants in the foreground so that insects do not have a chance to move pollen between different plants of different varieties, but they are still allowed to move pollen between plants of the same variety. However, this would require you to cover and uncover these plants somewhat frequently so that at different times they're exposed to insects that can pollinate each of the flowers. It's also possible to introduce pollinators, and you can see these much larger tents here that we have on the farm that we use for isolating insect pollinated plants. This is the inside of one of those tents with what looks like maybe melons or cucumbers growing inside. Again, these plants require insects to move pollen from the male flower to the female flower. So if we simply covered all these plants up, there would be no vector to move pollen around. So what we do is we grow plants inside these cages, we'll unzip the tent, and we'll introduce some pollinators. We have these solitary leaf-cutting bees that we introduce to the tent. They travel around to different blossoms, moving pollen between male and female flowers. They only live about a week. They don't form hives. After the bees have finished their pollination and died, we'll mark any fruit that is set by tying a ribbon around it, and then we know that those fruits have been pollinated with insects, and those insects have only moved pollen around within this tent. And in this tent there are several plants of just one melon variety. For wind-pollinated plants, it's not possible to simply put some sort of mesh tent around it because the pollen can still travel readily through the tent. For corn, we use paper bags slipped over the ears to prevent pollen from other corn plants of different varieties from reaching those silks and fertilizing those ovaries. And for more information on corn isolation, we do have a separate webinar. We have a webinar specifically on hand pollinating corn, which is what we do with our corn varieties here on the farm. Rather than discuss hand pollination here, I'd like to refer you to that webinar. We also have a great webinar on hand pollinating squash as well. If you're not interested in a physical barrier, if you don't have the resources to put up a big tent around your squash plants and introduce a bunch of bees to that tent, hand pollination might be the way to go, and I'd refer you to our hand pollination webinars for some of that information. And some other great resources for isolation and physical barriers and hand pollination. Some of these publications would be great as well. Seed to Seed by Suzanne Ashworth is the most comprehensive seed saving book that's out there. The Organic Seed Grower is somewhat more recent by John Navazio of the Organic Seed Alliance. Organic Seed Alliance also has a free publication called the Seed Saving Guide for Gardeners and Farmers, available at seedalliance.org/publications. Not quite as detailed as Seed to Seed or the Organic Seed Grower, but it is free, and it does have information about plant pollination, isolation distances, and a little bit of information about physical barriers used in isolation. And as I mentioned, other Seed Savers Exchange webinars, like our hand pollination webinars, are great sources of information regarding proper seed saving. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming, and I look forward to seeing you at future webinars.